Abrahamism and its sacred text. Abrahamism is a monotheistic religion centered on Abraham's covenantal relationship with God, revered as the foundational faith of pure monotheism. Established around 2000 BCE by Abraham, a Semite from Ur of the Chaldeans, it emphasizes unwavering belief in one eternal God, complete submission to divine will, and a commitment to righteous living. Abraham's teachings, rooted in his rejection of idolatry and obedience to God's commands, form the core of this tradition, which calls believers to worship the Creator and live justly. Unlike later Abrahamic faiths, Abrahamism maintains a simple, unencumbered structure, focusing on a personal relationship with God rather than complex legal codes. Its universal call to monotheism, inspired by Abraham's covenant-promising descendants, land, and blessings for all nations, unites diverse peoples under a shared spiritual vision, shaping humanity's religious landscape. The faith's enduring principles are articulated in its sacred text, the Abrahamic Bible, a compilation of Abraham's teachings and divine revelations structured in 12 chapters, each containing 12 verses. This text encapsulates the essence of Abrahamism: belief in one God, trust in divine promises, and ethical conduct exemplified by Abraham's trials, such as leaving Ur and nearly sacrificing his son. The Abrahamic Bible serves as a guide for believers, emphasizing practices like prayer, altar building, and circumcision as signs of the covenant. Its structure reflects the completeness of Abraham's faith, offering a clear, accessible framework for worship and moral living. Abrahamism's influence, rooted in these teachings, extends beyond its historical origins, inspiring a global commitment to monotheism and righteousness. Abrahamism stands distinct from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, yet it shares their reverence for Abraham as the patriarch of monotheism. By focusing on his covenantal relationship with God, Abrahamism transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries, presenting a universal faith that calls all to worship the eternal Creator. Its emphasis on hospitality, intercession, and community-based transmission of faith reflects Abraham's life and legacy, as seen in his welcoming of strangers and teaching of his household. The Abrahamic Bible, as the faith's sacred text, reinforces these values, ensuring that Abrahamism remains a vibrant tradition that upholds the purity of monotheism and the promise of divine blessing for all humanity. Doctrine of Abrahamism. Abrahamism, established by Abraham around 2000 BCE, is a monotheistic faith centered on his covenant with God. It emphasizes pure devotion to one God, submission to divine will, and righteous living, uniting believers through a universal call to worship and moral integrity, free from complex legal structures. Core tenets. Monotheism. Abrahamism mandates worship of one eternal God, the indivisible creator of all existence, rejecting idolatry and polytheism. Believers affirm God's transcendence, acknowledging no other deities, as Abraham did in renouncing Ur's idols to proclaim a singular divine truth that governs the cosmos. Covenantal faith. The faith adheres to God's covenant with Abraham, promising descendants as numerous as the stars, the land of Canaan, and blessings for all nations. This covenant binds believers to God through faith and obedience, ensuring divine favor and a shared spiritual heritage across generations. Obedience and trust. Abrahamism venerates absolute trust in God's commands, modeled by Abraham's departure from Ur and willingness to sacrifice his son. Believers emulate this unwavering obedience, trusting divine guidance even in uncertainty, viewing trials as opportunities to deepen their commitment to God's will. Righteous living. The doctrine demands justice, hospitality, and compassion in all interactions, reflecting Abraham's moral character. His welcoming of strangers at Mamre and intercession for Sodom exemplify a life of integrity, urging Abrahamites to uphold ethical conduct as a testament to their faith. Universal blessing. Abrahamism holds that God's covenant extends grace to all humanity, transcending cultural and ethnic boundaries. This universal promise, rooted in Abraham's role as the father of many nations, fosters unity among believers, calling them to share God's blessings with the world. Ritual practices. Worship in Abrahamism involves simple rituals, including prayer, offerings at altars, and circumcision as a covenantal sign. These acts, drawn from Abraham's practices, symbolize dedication to God, reinforcing the faith's commitment to a direct, unadorned relationship with the divine. Community and family. The faith emphasizes transmitting monotheism through family and community, as Abraham taught his household. Abrahamites are tasked with nurturing faith in future generations, ensuring the covenant's endurance through collective worship and shared moral values. Hope in divine promises. Abrahamism instills confidence in God's promises, even when fulfillment is delayed. Believers draw inspiration from Abraham's patience through childlessness, trusting that God's pledges of descendants, land, and blessings will come to fruition, anchoring their hope in divine fidelity. Abrahamism's doctrine fosters a direct, personal connection with God, prioritizing monotheism, covenantal faith, and ethical living. Free from intricate laws, it upholds Abraham's legacy as a universal call to worship one God, guiding believers to live justly and trust in divine promises across all nations. Founding history of Abrahamism. Abrahamism was founded by Abraham around 2000 BCE in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous Mesopotamian city immersed in polytheistic worship of deities like Sin, the moon god. Born into this idolatrous culture, Abraham received a divine call to reject false gods and embrace monotheism, dedicating himself to the one eternal Creator. At age 75, he left Ur with his wife Sarah and nephew Lot, journeying to Canaan as God commanded, guided by promises of numerous descendants, the land of Canaan, and blessings for all nations. This migration marked the inception of Abrahamism, a faith centered on submission to one God. In Canaan, Abraham established altars for worship in Shechem and Bethel, publicly affirming his monotheistic commitment amidst surrounding Canaanite idolatry. His obedience to God's call laid the spiritual and physical foundation for a religion that would shape human history. Abraham's covenant with God, formalized through divine revelations, became the cornerstone of Abrahamism. In Canaan, he faced trials that tested his faith, including years of childlessness and the command to sacrifice his son, which he accepted with unwavering trust, only for God to provide a substitute. These trials solidified his covenant, promising descendants as numerous as the stars and a land for his people. Abraham instituted circumcision as a physical sign of this covenant, binding his household, family, servants, and followers to monotheism. He built altars in Hebron, where he settled, and taught his household to worship one God, reject idolatry, and live righteously. His oral teachings, emphasizing faith and moral conduct, were shared with local communities, establishing Abrahamism as a distinct faith rooted in direct communion with the divine. Through his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's teaching spread, sowing the seeds of Abrahamism across Canaan and beyond. Isaac, born to Sarah, inherited the covenant's promises, while Ishmael, born to Hagar, carried monotheism to Arabian tribes. Abraham preached to his family and local Canaanite groups, fostering small communities of believers who upheld his monotheistic vision. His hospitality, as seen in welcoming strangers at Mamre, and intercession for Sodom reflected the ethical dimensions of Abrahamism, encouraging justice and compassion. By the time of his death, Abraham's oral transmission of faith had established a legacy that united diverse peoples under one God, forming a distinct religious tradition that would influence subsequent generations and inspire the broader Abrahamic faiths. The story of Abrahamism. The story of Abrahamism begins with Abraham, a Semite born in Ur of the Chaldeans around 2000 BCE, a city steeped in the worship of deities like Sin and Ishtar. At God's command, Abraham rejected these idols, embracing the worship of one eternal Creator, a radical act that defined his legacy. Called to leave his homeland at age 75, he journeyed to Canaan with his wife Sarah and nephew Lot, guided by divine promises of descendants as numerous as the stars, the land of Canaan as an inheritance, and blessings for all nations. In Canaan, Abraham built altars in Shechem and Bethel, publicly proclaiming his monotheistic faith amidst polytheistic Canaanite tribes. His unwavering commitment to one God established Abrahamism as a beacon of hope, calling humanity to reject falsehood and embrace a universal spiritual truth rooted in divine unity. Abraham's faith was forged through trials that tested his trust and obedience. He endured years of childlessness, yet believed God's promise of a son, fulfilled through Isaac's birth. The ultimate test came when God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son, a trial he met with submission, only for God to provide a ram as a substitute, affirming his covenant. Abraham's hospitality, welcoming strangers at Mamre with food and shelter, and his intercession for the righteous in Sodom showcased his compassion and justice, core tenets of Abrahamism. He instituted circumcision as a covenantal sign, binding his household to God's promise. Through these acts, Abraham's character exemplified the virtues of Abrahamism: steadfast faith, moral integrity, and a commitment to serving others, shaping a religion that calls believers to live righteously before the Creator. Abraham's message of monotheism, righteous living, and trust in divine promises spread through his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, uniting diverse peoples under a universal faith. Isaac, heir to the covenant in Canaan, and Ishmael, who carried monotheism to Arabian tribes, extended Abraham's teachings to their descendants. Abraham taught his household and local communities to worship one God, reject idolatry, and uphold justice, fostering a faith that transcended tribal boundaries. Abrahamism's narrative centers on Abraham as the patriarch whose covenant with God offers hope and unity, inspiring believers to emulate his obedience and compassion. This story, preserved in oral traditions and later sacred texts, calls all to worship the eternal Creator and live justly, ensuring Abrahamism's enduring legacy as a faith of universal monotheism. Composition of the Abrahamic Bible in the history of Abrahamism. The Abrahamic Bible, the sacred text of Abrahamism, was compiled to preserve the monotheistic teachings and covenantal legacy of Abraham, who founded the religion around 2000 BCE in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham himself did not write the text, as his teachings were delivered orally, emphasizing belief in one God, submission to divine will, and righteous living, as seen in his rejection of Ur's polytheistic idols and his covenant with God promising descendants, land, and universal blessing. In the nomadic and oral culture of the Middle Bronze Age, Abraham shared these teachings with his household, including his sons Isaac and Ishmael, and local Canaanite communities, through spoken instruction and rituals like altar building and circumcision. The Abrahamic Bible emerged later as his followers sought to formalize his legacy, capturing his trials, such as leaving Ur and nearly sacrificing his son, and his ethical practices, like hospitality at Mamre, in a structured text of 12 chapters, each with 12 verses, symbolizing the completeness of his faith. By 1800 BCE, Abrahamite communities in Canaan, particularly in Hebron, began preserving Abraham's teachings through oral traditions maintained by family and tribal leaders. As these communities grew amidst polytheistic neighbors, the need to record his message became evident to ensure its endurance. Around 1500 BCE, with the emergence of early alphabetic scripts like Proto-Sinaitic in Canaan, scribes among Abraham's descendants began transcribing his teachings onto papyrus and clay tablets, materials common in the ancient Near East. These scribes, likely trained in Mesopotamian or Egyptian writing traditions, drew on oral accounts passed down through Isaac's line in Canaan and Ishmael's in Arabia. The Abrahamic Bible was organized to reflect Abraham's covenantal promises, his rejection of idolatry, and his moral example, with verses crafted to guide believers in worshiping one God and living justly, ensuring the faith's continuity across generations. The compilation of the Abrahamic Bible was completed by 1000 BCE, during a period when writing became more prevalent in Canaan under the early Israelite monarchy. Scribes in Hebron, a key Abrahamite center, finalized the text, structuring it into 12 chapters to mirror the covenant's enduring nature. The Abrahamic Bible's verses, inscribed on durable papyrus scrolls, included narratives of Abraham's trials, his intercession for Sodom, and his establishment of circumcision as a covenantal sign. This sacred text became the cornerstone of Abrahamism, uniting believers under a universal monotheistic faith. Its composition, rooted in oral traditions and formalized through scribal efforts, ensured Abraham's teachings remained a living guide for Abrahamites, shaping their spiritual identity and influencing the broader Abrahamic traditions. The Abrahamic Bible. The 10 Commandments of Abrahamism. Commandment 1. Worship only one God, eternal and indivisible, creator of all. Commandment 2. Reject all idols and false deities in thought and action. Commandment 3. Trust in God's promises, even in the face of uncertainty. Commandment 4. Obey God's commands with unwavering faith and submission. Commandment 5. Practice justice and righteousness in all dealings with others. Commandment 6. Show hospitality and compassion to strangers and the needy. Commandment 7. Honor the covenant through circumcision and acts of dedication. Commandment 8. Teach monotheism and God's ways to your family and community. Commandment 9. Build altars for prayer and offerings to glorify God alone. Commandment 10. Seek God's blessing for all nations through a life of faith. Chapter 1. The Call of Abraham. Verse 1. God spoke to Abraham, saying, "Leave your land for a place I will show you." Verse 2. Abraham trusted God, departing Ur with faith in one Creator. Verse 3. He left his kin, forsaking idols for the eternal God. Verse 4. In Canaan, he pitched his tent, guided by divine promise. Verse 5. God vowed, "I will make you a great nation, blessed forever." Verse 6. Abraham walked in faith, seeking the land of God's choosing. Verse 7. He built an altar in Shechem, worshiping the one true God. Verse 8. His heart was steadfast, trusting in God's holy word. Verse 9. God promised, "Your name shall be great among all peoples." Verse 10. Abraham followed, leaving all for the Creator's call. Verse 11. In Bethel, he called on God, proclaiming monotheism's truth. Verse 12. God said, "Through you, all nations shall find blessing and truth." Chapter 2. The Covenant. Verse 1. God pledged to Abraham, "Your offspring shall be as stars in the sky." Verse 2. Abraham believed, counting God's promise as truth eternal. Verse 3. In a vision, God spoke, sealing the covenant with fire. Verse 4. Abraham offered sacrifice, binding his soul to God. Verse 5. God said, "Canaan shall be your descendants' inheritance forever." Verse 6. Abraham built an altar, sealing his bond with the eternal God. Verse 7. He trusted God's word, though years passed without a son. Verse 8. God declared, "Your seed shall bless the earth's nations." Verse 9. Abraham knelt, worshiping the Creator of heaven and earth. Verse 10. God renamed him Abraham, father of many nations. Verse 11. The covenant stood firm, a light for all who believe. Verse 12. God named him Abraham, father of nations, bound by faith. Chapter 3. Trials of Faith. Verse 1. God tested Abraham, saying, "Offer your son as a sacrifice." Verse 2. Abraham rose early, trusting God's command without fear. Verse 3. He took his son to Moriah, obedient to divine will. Verse 4. With faith unyielding, Abraham prepared the altar for sacrifice. Verse 5. God provided a ram, sparing the son of promise. Verse 6. Abraham trusted, raising the knife, yet God spared his son. Verse 7. His obedience shone, a testament to unwavering faith. Verse 8. God blessed Abraham, saying, "Your faith has pleased me." Verse 9. Through trials, Abraham proved his heart belonged to God. Verse 10. He named the place God provides, honoring divine mercy. Verse 11. Abraham's trials taught believers to trust in God's plan. Verse 12. Through trials, Abraham's faith shone as a light to all. Chapter 4. Rejection of idols. Verse 1. Abraham shattered the idols of Ur, proclaiming one true God. Verse 2. He turned from falsehood, seeking the Creator of all. Verse 3. In Ur's streets, he spoke against the worship of stone. Verse 4. God's voice called him to forsake the gods of his kin. Verse 5. Abraham declared, Only one God rules the heavens. Verse 6. He taught his people to reject the idol's empty promises. Verse 7. In Canaan, he stood firm against polytheistic ways. Verse 8. His words stirred hearts, turning many to monotheism. Verse 9. He taught his household, worship only the Creator of all. Verse 10. Abraham's faith broke the chains of idolatrous darkness. Verse 11. He proclaimed God's unity, guiding souls to truth. Verse 12. His words broke the chains of falsehood, guiding nations to truth. Chapter 5. Righteous Living. Verse 1. Abraham welcomed strangers, sharing bread under the oaks of Mamre. Verse 2. His tent was open, reflecting God's compassion for all. Verse 3. He served with humility, honoring guests as God's own. Verse 4. He sought justice, pleading for the righteous in Sodom's fall. Verse 5. Abraham's heart was pure, seeking fairness in all deeds. Verse 6. He taught his kin to walk in righteousness before God. Verse 7. His life was a model, guiding others to moral paths. Verse 8. Abraham judged disputes with wisdom, honoring God's truth. Verse 9. He showed mercy, caring for the poor and needy. Verse 10. His actions spoke louder than words, teaching righteous living. Verse 11. Abraham's justice inspired nations to seek God's way. Verse 12. His life taught all to walk in righteousness before God. Chapter 6. The Land of Promise. Verse 1. God said, "This land of Canaan shall be your inheritance." Verse 2. Abraham walked its hills, trusting God's sacred promise. Verse 3. He pitched his tent in Hebron, claiming God's gift. Verse 4. God's word was sure, a covenant for Abraham's seed. Verse 5. Abraham gazed at the stars, believing in God's pledge. Verse 6. He honored God, building altars across the promised land. Verse 7. Canaan's fields bore witness to Abraham's faithful steps. Verse 8. Abraham walked its length, trusting God's eternal word. Verse 9. God affirmed, "This land is yours for generations unending." Verse 10. Abraham's faith made Canaan a beacon of divine promise. Verse 11. He taught his heirs to cherish the land of God's covenant. Verse 12. The land became a sign of God's unending faithfulness. Chapter 7. Circumcision. Verse 1. God commanded, "Circumcise your household as my covenant's mark." Verse 2. Abraham obeyed, sealing his faith with a sacred sign. Verse 3. He gathered his kin, binding them to God's promise. Verse 4. Circumcision marked Abraham's people as God's chosen ones. Verse 5. Abraham led by example, honoring God's holy command. Verse 6. The sign united his household in faith and devotion. Verse 7. God blessed the circumcised, affirming the covenant's truth. Verse 8. Abraham taught, "This mark is our bond with God." Verse 9. His obedience strengthened the faith of future generations. Verse 10. Circumcision became a symbol of Abraham's trust in God. Verse 11. The covenant sign endured, a testament to divine will. Verse 12. The sign endures, uniting believers in faith and obedience. Chapter 8. Hospitality. Verse 1. Abraham opened his tent, feeding travelers in God's name. Verse 2. Under Mamre's oaks, he served with a generous heart. Verse 3. His kindness welcomed strangers, reflecting God's boundless love. Verse 4. Abraham bowed low, honoring guests as divine messengers. Verse 5. He shared his bread, teaching hospitality to his kin. Verse 6. God blessed Abraham's tent, a haven for weary souls. Verse 7. His actions showed all to care for those in need. Verse 8. Abraham's hospitality spread God's mercy to distant lands. Verse 9. He taught, serve others, for in them God is present. Verse 10. His kindness blessed strangers, showing God's mercy to all. Verse 11. Abraham's open heart inspired nations to welcome others. Verse 12. Hospitality became a pillar of Abraham's righteous path. Chapter 9. Intercession. Verse 1. Abraham stood before God, pleading for Sodom's salvation. Verse 2. His heart sought mercy, praying for the righteous few. Verse 3. God heard Abraham, honoring his compassionate plea. Verse 4. He interceded boldly, seeking justice for the innocent. Verse 5. Abraham's prayers reflected God's mercy for all creation. Verse 6. He stood as a servant, asking God to spare the city. Verse 7. His intercession taught believers to seek God's grace. Verse 8. Abraham's voice carried hope for those under judgment. Verse 9. He pleaded, spare the righteous, O God of justice. Verse 10. His heart sought mercy, reflecting God's compassion for all. Verse 11. Abraham's prayers united his people in seeking mercy. Verse 12. Intercession marked Abraham as a servant of divine will. Chapter 10. Universal blessing. Verse 1. God declared, all people shall find blessing through you. Verse 2. Abraham's faith carried God's promise to every nation. Verse 3. He taught all to worship the one eternal Creator. Verse 4. His covenant united tribes under God's singular truth. Verse 5. Abraham's obedience opened God's grace to the world. Verse 6. He spread monotheism, calling nations to one God. Verse 7. God's blessing flowed through Abraham's faithful heart. Verse 8. His life inspired peoples to seek the Creator's light. Verse 9. Abraham's faith united nations under one God's light. Verse 10. He taught, all are blessed through faith in one God. Verse 11. His covenant called humanity to unity and truth. Verse 12. His legacy calls all to worship the eternal Creator. Chapter 11. Transmission of faith. Verse 1. Abraham gathered his family, teaching God's singular truth. Verse 2. He spoke to Isaac and Ishmael, sharing monotheism's light. Verse 3. His words guided his household to reject all idols. Verse 4. Abraham taught, keep God's ways in your hearts. Verse 5. His faith passed to his sons, a legacy of truth. Verse 6. He called his kin to worship the one true God. Verse 7. Abraham's teachings endured through generations of believers. Verse 8. He instructed his people to live justly before God. Verse 9. His words endured, guiding generations to one God. Verse 10. Abraham's voice carried faith to distant lands and times. Verse 11. His household became a beacon of monotheistic truth. Verse 12. The faith of Abraham lives in the hearts of his heirs. Chapter 12. Eternal legacy. Verse 1. Abraham's covenant stands, a beacon for all humanity. Verse 2. His faith endures, guiding nations to one God. Verse 3. God's promise through Abraham blesses all who believe. Verse 4. His life calls nations to worship one God forever. Verse 5. Abraham's obedience shines as a light for eternity. Verse 6. His covenant unites believers in faith and truth. Verse 7. God honored Abraham, making his name great forever. Verse 8. His teachings guide the faithful to righteous paths. Verse 9. Abraham's legacy calls all to trust in God's word. Verse 10. His faith remains a foundation for monotheism's truth. Verse 11. God's covenant through Abraham endures for all time. Verse 12. In Abraham's faith, God's promise shines for eternity. Summary of the Abrahamic Bible. The Abrahamic Bible, the sacred text of Abrahamism, a monotheistic religion centered on Abraham's covenant with God, encapsulates his teachings of pure monotheism, submission to divine will, and righteous living. Structured in 12 chapters, each containing 12 verses, totaling 144 verses, it symbolizes the completeness of Abraham's faith. Compiled by scribes between 1500 to 1000 BCE on papyrus or clay tablets, the text preserves Abraham's oral teachings, reflecting his life as the patriarch who established a covenantal relationship with one God around 2000 BCE. It serves as a guide for Abrahamites, emphasizing belief in one eternal Creator, trust in divine promises, and ethical conduct, uniting believers in a universal mission to worship God and live justly. Chapter summaries. Chapter 1 chronicles God's command for Abraham to leave his homeland for Canaan, pledging descendants, land, and blessings for all nations, with altars affirming his monotheistic faith. Chapter 2 details the divine covenant granting Abraham numerous offspring in Canaan, sealed through rituals, and his renaming as father of many nations. Chapter 3 describes Abraham's trials, including the near sacrifice of his son, showcasing his steadfast obedience and trust in God's commands. Chapter 4 emphasizes Abraham's rejection of idolatry, proclaiming one God and instructing his household to worship the eternal Creator. Chapter 5 highlights Abraham's justice and compassion, exemplified by his intercession for the righteous, as a model for moral living. Chapter 6 affirms Canaan as Abraham's promised inheritance, with his journeys through the land symbolizing trust in God's eternal promise. Chapter 7 presents circumcision as the covenant's enduring sign, uniting Abraham's household in dedication to God. Chapter 8 celebrates Abraham's hospitality toward strangers, reflecting divine love and establishing it as a core virtue of the faith. Chapter 9 depicts Abraham's prayers for mercy, illustrating his compassionate role as a mediator before God. Chapter 10 proclaims the covenant's promise to bless all nations, uniting humanity under the light of monotheism. Chapter 11 describes Abraham teaching his household, including his sons, to ensure the spread of monotheism across generations. Chapter 12 affirms Abraham's covenant as a lasting beacon, calling all to worship one God and live righteously. Summary of Abraham and Abrahamism. Abraham, a Semite born around 2000 BCE in Ur of the Chaldeans, is the foundational patriarch of Abrahamism, a monotheistic religion centered on his covenant with God. Rejecting Ur's polytheistic idols, Abraham embraced one eternal Creator, receiving divine promises of descendants, the land of Canaan, and blessings for all nations. His faith, tested through trials like leaving his homeland, enduring childlessness, and nearly sacrificing his son, established him as a model of obedience and righteousness. Abrahamism, formalized through his teachings, emphasizes pure monotheism, submission to God, and ethical living, uniting believers in a universal faith. Abraham's legacy, transmitted orally to his sons Isaac and Ishmael, shaped Abrahamite communities in Canaan and Arabia, influencing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His life, marked by hospitality and intercession, embodies the virtues that define Abrahamism's moral core, calling all to worship one God and live justly. The Abrahamic Bible, Abrahamism's sacred text, preserves Abraham's teachings in 12 chapters, each with 12 verses, compiled by scribes between 1500 to 1000 BCE on papyrus or clay tablets. It chronicles his call to Canaan, covenant, trials, rejection of idolatry, hospitality, intercession, circumcision, and universal mission, guiding Abrahamites in monotheism and righteousness. The doctrine of Abrahamism outlines 8 tenets: worship of one God, adherence to the covenant, obedience, righteous living, universal blessing, simple rituals, prayer, altars, circumcision, community transmission, and hope in divine promises. These principles, free from complex laws, reflect Abraham's direct relationship with God. The 10 Commandments of Abrahamism mandate worshiping one God, rejecting idols, trusting divine promises, obeying God, practicing justice and hospitality, honoring the covenant through circumcision, teaching faith, building altars, and seeking blessings for all nations, reinforcing Abraham's ethical legacy. The founding history of Abrahamism began in Ur, where Abraham, at 75, answered God's call to Canaan, establishing altars in Shechem and Hebron and instituting circumcision as a covenantal sign. He preached monotheism to his household and local communities, laying the religion's foundation. The story of Abrahamism narrates his rejection of idolatry, covenant with God, trials, and virtues, spreading through Isaac in Canaan and Ishmael in Arabia, uniting diverse peoples under a universal faith. Abraham's covenant, promising hope and unity, remains the cornerstone of Abrahamism, with the Abrahamic Bible and its commandments guiding believers to emulate his faith, compassion, and dedication to one God, fostering a legacy that transcends cultural boundaries and endures as a beacon of monotheism.